Really been watching Gaza quite closely. We saw the All Eyes on Rafah social media campaign a few weeks ago, but you are watching the northern border. So what exactly do people need to know, besides what you just said, about exactly what is happening on Israel's northern border?
Sure. Well, I mean, look, first of all, Hezbollah is a wholly owned proxy of Iran. And people need to understand this. And it also happens to have essential full control over the government of Lebanon. There is no government, in fact. I mean, there's not been a newly elected government in this country for several years running. They're in massive debt due to Hezbollah corruption. And so there's no structure to work with right now. So there are all these different, including the US government, the French government, they're all trying to work with the Lebanese to try to avert a full-blown conflict, but they don't have legitimate partners to work with. And so, of course, those efforts are failing. I mentioned the 200,000 rockets. That's obviously very concerning for the Israelis. That's something like 7 times the amount that Hamas had at the beginning of the war in October of last year. That's a massive amount of rockets that can come into Israel on any given day if a full-blown war begins. They also have what they call precision guided munitions, about 1,500 of those that are extremely accurate and that can hit strategic targets in Israel, like their purported nuclear facility, for example, which could create a mass casualty event. And the Israelis have been very wary of what might occur if a full-blown war erupts. You could see, skyscrapers topple in Israel, sort of like what we saw on 9/11 here in this country. So there is a massive war that is just, I talked to an Israeli diplomat the other day who told me that we're 30 seconds to midnight in terms of this conflict. And it would be, in my view, the largest and most destructive war that we have seen in a century in the Middle East. And, obviously there's a lot of competition for destructive wars. So this is a very scary one. And I think that, the headlines have been misleading. That, in Gaza, Israel's on the 5-yard line. They're very close to finishing off what they started, and they just need the U.S. to essentially give the green light. But that does not it pales in comparison to what we could see on the northern border. That's where Israel has deployed a massive amount of assets. They've kept, I think, 3/4 of their Air Force free so that they are able to handle the northern border if and when that conflict erupts.
We are 30 seconds to midnight from what you say could be the largest, most consequential conflict in the Middle East in a century. What
Correct.
could stop the hands of the clock from ticking all the way to midnight there?
It's a good question. I mean, there is a school of thought that says let Israel finish its war in Gaza, and then at that point, Hezbollah may stop fighting. In other words, it would be a sign from the U.S. Or from the West that Israel has the support of its allies, and that after that Israel would be able to turn its sights fully to the north, potentially again with the backing of the West. That's one way this thing can work. Another way is, of course, a brokered solution, but that would mean that Hezbollah has to be willing to stand down and to evacuate its forces something like 10 miles north of the border. There is a river, it's called the Litani River. There is already a UN Security Council resolution that calls for no armed forces, irregular armed forces, below the Litani River at that 10-mile marker. Hezbollah has been in gross violation of that Security Council resolution for nearly, 2 decades now. And so unless we're somehow able to convince Hezbollah to do that, I'm not sure how this is going to work, but diplomacy could somehow still prevail. The other way is to actually hold Iran accountable. And I actually think that this is really the answer that is needed here, that Iran needs to be convinced that if it continues to support all of its proxies that are waging war across the Middle East right now, then unless they bring those proxies to heel, that there could be a terrible price diplomatically, economically, even militarily. But right now, what we've seen from the US, from the UN, from the Europeans, is really an attempt to continue to engage with the regime. And I find this so shocking that the Iranian regime has not been held to account for a war that they have sponsored. You have to remember, it's their arms, their weapons, their money, their training, their ideological indoctrination that has Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, all of these proxies, they are doing this at the behest of the Islamic Republic. And for some reason, the pressure has not been on Iran to this point. I have long held from the moment that this thing erupted in October of last year that unless we put the right kind of pressure on the Iranians, we're not going to get anywhere in terms of curbing this conflict. The pressure that we see on Israel right now as it defends itself is really hard to believe. I've never seen anything like this before. The mounting international pressure on a country that didn't want the war, that didn't start the war, and that's trying to recover hostages, how they're the ones that are receiving this pressure from around the world is shocking to me. The aggressor here has been Iran and its proxies. That's where I think the effort needs to be if we're to try to stop the clock at 30 seconds before midnight.
The pressure needs to be on Iran.